I received an ancient inheritance. I formed a golden core on the spot, and 7 days later, I would reach the great completion stage. I had planned to hide away between heaven and earth and live as a hermit immortal. But who would have thought the inheritance itself would notify the whole world? Can't be helped. I wanted to keep a low profile too, but my strength just wouldn't allow it. My name is Cheng. This is the name I had after forming my golden core. Before that, I was also called Cheng. At this moment, my consciousness was in chaos, and endless information poured into my mind like a flood. The birth of the universe, the fall of stars, the rise and collapse of civilizations, an indescribable aura flowed between all things, and, in that hazy state, my golden core was already formed. An ancient, vast voice rang out across the entire world, like a decree delivered by the heavens. The inheritance has been activated. The golden core is formed. In 7 days, great completion may be attained. What just happened? Did I hallucinate? What was that voice just now? Golden core. Great completion. Mom. Not going to work anymore. Going to cultivate immortality. The silent night suddenly boiled over. Some said it was an alien invasion. Some dropped to their knees and began to pray. Some pointed into the dark and said the end of the world had arrived. And I simply watched all of it in silence, quietly listening to the voice inside my mind. Inheritor, I will announce one piece of your information to the whole world every day. Until 7 days have passed, you have one chance to address the entire world. Would you like to use it now? A test from the inheritance. I focused my mind and calmly felt the power within my body. The golden core spun in my dantian, releasing an endless stream of spiritual power. With a thought, a 44-pound dumbbell in the corner flew into my hand. Steel that had once seemed unbreakable couldn't withstand even 1% of my strength. I bent it casually. Then, I slammed the dumbbell straight into my face. I didn't feel the slightest discomfort. Instead, the dumbbell snapped cleanly in two. Seeing that, I smiled. Now, I want to address the entire world. I raised my head, my gaze piercing through the ceiling and toward the night sky. My voice was calm and clear. Everyone. Ed, the one speaking to you now, is the chosen one who has received the inheritance. Before this, I had never felt that the world was so beautiful, as if everything was now within my grasp. Golden core stage. Even if it's only golden core stage, I am already unimaginably powerful by human standards. Aside from nuclear weapons, I can't think of any method in the modern world that could harm me. Of course, not saying this to show off. I only want to tell everyone one thing. I am benevolent. I have no intention of harming anyone, nor any intention of changing the order of this world. That's all. The speech ended. The world exploded. My words were repeated countless times by countless people. My phrasing was analyzed word by word, sentence by sentence, all to judge just how dangerous I might be. The militaries of every nation urgently convened meetings, and nuclear missile silos all entered combat readiness. But the more direct effect was that panic had begun. Who was I? Where was I? What did I want to do? Those questions became inescapable mysteries in everyone's hearts. A human-shaped nuclear bomb hidden among the endless sea of humanity was enough in itself to make anyone shudder. But I made no unnecessary moves. I walked into my bedroom, lay down on the bed, and began trying to understand the power inside me. The golden core continued spinning like a burning star. Spiritual power flowed through my meridians. Everything within a radius of dozens of miles appeared in my mind. Within that range, I felt like a god. If golden core stage was already like this, then what about great completion? I began looking forward to it. 7 days later, the mighty power of great completion would naturally reveal itself, but the world's official institutions clearly had no intention of giving me those 7 days. At midnight, the first piece of information was announced. The Inheritor, male. That was it. There were at least 3,500,000,000 men in the world. That first clue was far too broad. I couldn't help smiling and shaking my head, but the official institutions were obviously not as relaxed as I was. Less than 10 minutes after the clue was released, the United Nations held an emergency meeting. Insiders leaked to the press that the 5 permanent members of the Security Council were already discussing overnight the creation of a global joint organization to deal with the Inheritor incident. During the daytime, having nothing better to do, I went out for a walk. The atmosphere on the streets was strange, tense, but excited. Most people were continuing their daily lives uneasily, though there was something obviously different in their eyes now. By evening, the global joint announcement was released. Nearly every television station interrupted programming. Every website pushed a pop-up. The wording had been polished carefully, full of emotion. The basic meaning was this: the Inheritor was a heaven-chosen individual, and, with him present, humanity would surely be led into a new century. Therefore, they earnestly requested that the Inheritor reveal himself and take on this great responsibility. Below the announcement were the signatures of leaders from every nation, packed tightly together. The heads of major powers even released videos, their speeches sincere, their attitudes humble, as if they were begging for the descent of a god, whether they meant it or not. I didn't care. At midnight, the second piece of information was announced: the Inheritor, unemployed. I was sitting in meditation, trying to cultivate. After all, I had nothing better to do. Unemployed. That narrowed the range somewhat, but it was still huge. The global population of unemployed people, freelancers, homemakers, retirees, and even babies still in swaddling cloth, all fit that category. The speed of the official response this time was much faster than yesterday. Less than an hour after the information was announced, an organization called the Global Joint Action Group for Inheritor Affairs was officially established. For short, the Joint Action Group. Its headquarters were set in Southeast Asia, and every participating nation sent elite personnel. The supreme commander was a Chinese man named Zhao Sheng. He had worked for Interpol for many years, especially skilled in cross-border manhunts and intelligence analysis, and enjoyed an extremely high reputation internationally. At the founding ceremony, Zhao Sheng gave a short but powerful speech. Respected Inheritor, sir, we have absolutely no ill will. The world needs you. Humanity needs you. Please believe us. We have already prepared everything for you. Not long after, a flood of reports spread everywhere. A private island in the Central Pacific called Eden had been designated as the Inheritor's exclusive territory. It was said the island had originally belonged to some international tycoon, but the Joint Action Group had requisitioned it in the name of the common interests of all humanity. Global bids had already opened for the island's reconstruction plan. With no budget ceiling at all, everything would be tailored to the Inheritor's preferences. I scrolled through the news item by item. An island, unlimited budget, all just to get me to show myself. If I were any ordinary person, I'd probably have already been moved by a temptation like that. But I wasn't ordinary anymore. At least, not now. If I wanted something, I would take it myself. Or, more prudently, wait a few days, and then take it. The next day, during the daytime, I went out for another stroll, as usual. Some were discussing the island. Some were discussing the end of the world. At a breakfast stall, one customer bit into a fried dough stick and sighed to his companion. That guy's luck is insane. He got the inheritance and now never has to work again. He never had to work in the first place. Hes, unemployed. The two of them burst into laughter. I laughed too, bought a fried dough stick, and kept walking while eating it. Workers from the local neighborhood office were putting up notices on the wall from 50 or so meters away. I took one glance and had already read the basic meaning. In response to the Joint Action Group's call, all unemployed residents in the district were asked to voluntarily register their information with the community office and cooperate with screening. There was a QR code below the notice. Just scan and fill out a form. I ignored it and kept wandering around. After all, this anonymous little life of mine only had a few more days left. At midnight, the third piece of information was announced: the Inheritor, blood type A. 5 minutes after the information was announced, my phone received a push notification. It was an emergency notice from the community. First, all residents were required to cooperate with a blood type census. Second, staff would come door to door tomorrow morning at 5 o'clock to register information, and everyone must cooperate. Blood type A. That narrowed things down much more than unemployed. Within the country alone, around 30% of the population had type of blood. Add on the conditions of male and what a say P, unemployed. And there were probably still at least 20 million left. 20 million. That still sounded like a lot, but it was already enough for the authorities to begin large-scale screening. Judging from the speed of this latest notice, the determination of the authorities to find me was enormous. As for the purpose, it hardly needed to be said. The sky was barely light when the knocking began. Two people stood outside the door. One was Director Wang from the neighborhood committee. ID passed the public staff board the day before and memorized his title at a glance. The other was a nurse in a white coat. Director Wang held a thick stack of forms and said politely, "Sorry to bother you. We're just going through the procedure. A quick blood draw. That's all." I understand. I understand. I stepped aside and let them in. Once I sat down, the nurse efficiently drew a tube of blood from my arm. As a golden core cultivator, controlling my own flesh and blood well enough to let them draw a perfectly ordinary sample was effortless. Director Wang hovered nearby, asking all kinds of questions and rapidly filling out the forms. I had nothing to hide, aside from the inheritance itself. Everything else, I answered, truthfully. The whole process took less than 3 minutes. They hurried off to the next home while I returned to my room to continue thinking about future cultivation. After dawn, I went out for my usual walk. Almost everyone on the street was talking about the Inheritor. The people going to work had no heart for work. The people doing business had no heart for business. Everyone's attention had been seized by the Inheritor. One convenience store owner had posted a sign at the entrance. Today, free bottled mineral water for blood type A only. Beside it, a barbershop had hung up a sign saying 50% off for blood type A customers. By noon, 3 rows of testing tents had already been erected in the sports plaza in the city center. This was the Sky-Net Plan, a globally synchronized operation led by the Joint Action Group and supported by governments worldwide. Starting at 2 p.m. every country on Earth would simultaneously halt work and classes to conduct physical fitness testing on all eligible populations. It was almost a carpet-style search. They weren't even trying to pretend anymore, but the actual effect was laughably weak. It was far too easy to deal with. Run 100 meters. Do a few push-ups. Measure blood pressure and heart rate. I deliberately controlled my performance, running a below-average time and stopping after 20 push-ups, panting heavily. Even those watching secretly through surveillance cameras wouldn't have seen the slightest flaw. Those body strength measurement devices were toys to me. After leaving the testing tent, a live stream reporter was randomly interviewing people. Handsome guy. Who do you hope the Inheritor turns out to be? The person being interviewed was a bespectacled man in his 30s, gentle-looking and bookish. He answered, "Anyone's fine, as long as it isn't Zhang Li." Zhang Li. Why is that? Because he still owes me money. The bespectacled man adjusted his glasses and suddenly shouted at the camera, "Zhang Li, pay me back!" That scared the reporter into quickly switching targets. I brushed past the reporter. No one gave me a second glance. Back home, I continued idly killing time by overthinking everything, just passing the time. Really, everything was proceeding exactly as ID expected. At midnight, the 4th piece of information was announced. The Inheritor. Surname, Cheng. I had been resting, with my eyes closed, but suddenly, I opened them. This clue was different from the previous ones. It was only a surname, but it shrank the target range by an enormous amount. The vast majority of foreigners were excluded immediately. Within the country, there were about 70 million people surnamed Cheng. Add in the earlier 3 conditions of male, unemployed, and blood type A, and that probably left around 6 million. 6 million. At the current rate of official operations, they could absolutely conduct a precise screening of those millions within 2 days, and once combined with the clues that would be released over the next 2 days, the number would likely shrink to below 10,000. In less than 3 minutes, I heard movement downstairs. Someone was shouting through a loudspeaker, their voice so loud that the whole street could hear it. "Attention, residents. In accordance with the unified deployment of the Joint Action Group, all individuals in the district surnamed Cheng will be screened today. Residents surnamed Cheng, please do not leave your homes and wait for staff to come register you. Repeating once more. Residents, surnamed Cheng, do not go out and wait for staff to come register you. The loudspeaker moved from far to near, then from near to far, repeating along the streets. Very soon, hurried footsteps echoed through the apartment hallway. Because of yesterday's registration, it was easy for the community office to find their targets. I didn't avoid them. There was no point. I simply stood quietly behind the door and waited for them to knock. The ones who came were still Director Wang and two young people in black uniforms, badges of the Joint Action Group pinned to their chests. Little Chen, your name is Chengdu, right? Director Wang smiled politely. Yes, I nodded. Then, please cooperate. We need to inspect the room. Director Wang stepped aside to show me the people behind him. These two comrades are from the Joint Action Group. I agreed at once. They didn't hold back. They searched through everything, even under the bed, and found nothing at all. The bent dumbbell had long since been returned to normal by my precise control. Aside from that, I had never displayed any superhuman trait, so naturally, there was nothing for them to find. Once they finished checking the room, the two exchanged a glance and shook their heads at Director Wang. Director Wang let out a weary breath and turned to me. Sorry for the trouble. Someone might still come again in the next couple of days. So, please bear with us. The entire city was undergoing the same screening, and it continued until the afternoon. After that came an even more detailed round of checks. Every community had set up testing points, and every target was required to undergo a second blood draw and a series of more complicated medical examinations. Some of the test items even sounded quite professional. Things like spiritual power fluctuation detection and genetic mutation screening. Needless to say, those names were just there to scare people. With the current level of world technology, I didn't believe spiritual power could actually be detected. After all, its mysteries could only be understood through direct possession. What surprised me, though, was that there really were people who were flagged as abnormal. According to the data released by the Joint Action Group by 6p. Sati Taoe that afternoon, the preliminary screening of all Cernamecan individuals matching the conditions had been completed worldwide. A total of 7,200,000 people. Among them, more than 1,400 were suspected of abnormalities and had been transferred to special observation points for further screening. When I saw the announcement, I laughed out loud without a care in the world. At midnight, the fifth piece of information was announced. The Inheritor, allergic to acetaminophen. I was genuinely surprised. I hadn't expected the ancient inheritance to be so modernized that it even knew of something like this. Either the inheritance could receive modern information, or it had long ago foreseen the future, or else there was some immortal quietly manipulating everything behind the scenes. I slapped my forehead lightly and forced my thoughts back to the present. Acetaminophen. I really was allergic to it, and severely so. If I took it, I'd instantly break out in hives and have difficulty breathing. I'd even been hospitalized for it once. But with my current physical strength, a little allergic reaction was no big deal. I could suppress it easily. At 5 in the morning, the Joint Action Group released an emergency order. All individuals worldwide who matched the conditions would be injected with an allergen test solution to confirm whether they were allergic to acetaminophen. Allergy to acetaminophen is actually a fairly common drug allergy, occurring in about 3 to 5% of cases, which meant that after this round of screening, the final number would fall to less than 400,000. That still sounded like a lot, but once divided among the hundreds or thousands of observation points around the globe, each point would only average a few hundred. The range had shrunk dramatically. For the first time, my heart actually stirred a little, not with tension or fear, with excitement. I forcefully suppressed that excitement in my heart and checked the time. 7 in the morning. According to the Joint Action Group's schedule, the global allergen test would begin at 8. That left only 1 hour. So I went out for breakfast, wandered around while eating, and quietly enjoyed what was likely one of the last bits of peace I'd have. At 8:45, I arrived outside the testing station. A cordon had already been set up there, and military trucks were parked all around. Outside the cordon, stood a sea of people, reporters, curious, onlookers, and even more relatives of those who were about to be injected with the allergen. At exactly 9 o'clock, the testing began. The staff uniformly read out the instructions. People lined up in more than a dozen lines, entering the testing rooms, one by one. Then came the sound of needles piercing skin, the sound of liquid being injected into veins, and then weak groans, one after another, without exception. They sounded from within the testing rooms. Something was wrong. I immediately sensed it. How could every single person who entered those rooms possibly be having allergic reactions? Even if they were allergic, the reaction speed was way too fast. It hadn't even been half a minute yet. The doors of the testing rooms were shut, but they could not block my spiritual sense. With a thought, the scenes inside every single room appeared in my mind. The first batch of people inside all had their bodies tensed straight, shivering faintly, eyes unfocused, on the verge of unconsciousness. And the medical staff seemed to have expected it. They were already putting oxygen masks over their faces. I was a little startled. Things really weren't that simple. The Joint Action Group had started panicking and was now gambling on a dangerous move. The syringes clearly said in black and white that they contained allergen solution, but in reality, that clearly wasn't what they were. It was some kind of poison that induced unconsciousness. It was easy for me to understand the Joint Action Group's logic. The Inheritor had golden core cultivation and a body far beyond human limits. An allergen that would have triggered a reaction when he was still ordinary might no longer have any effect now. So they needed a poison that the Inheritor would likely endure, but ordinary people absolutely could not. If the Inheritor wanted to use this test to eliminate suspicion, then, after being injected with that poison, he would most likely try to show no reaction at all. And the only one capable of showing no reaction at all would be the Inheritor. While I was thinking through this, the people who had become dizzy and weak gradually regained control over their bodies. I secretly let out a breath. It seemed the Joint Action Group hadn't yet gone completely insane. That poison looked vicious, but in truth, it placed no major burden on the body. 2 hours later, it was my turn. I entered the testing room, relaxed my entire body, and let the poison run through me. Chest tightness, dizziness, nausea, weakness in the limbs. None of that happened as expected, even without resisting in any way. The poison couldn't stir up even a ripple in my body. No helping it. I had to pretend. I faked unconsciousness, stiffened my body, and made it tremble slightly. I wasn't exactly a born actor, but after waiting in line for so long and having watched this happen hundreds of times from boredom, I knew perfectly well what kind of reaction they expected after the injection. So I didn't slip up. The doctor quickly put an oxygen mask over my face. A staff member nearby wrote something on a form, then reassured me, feeling dizzy and weak is normal. It'll pass in a few minutes. After that, well, inject the real allergen one more time. Someone wheeled me into the observation room. Inside the observation room, doctors were busy injecting the true allergen into everyone. I made myself display the symptoms of an allergic reaction. After all the effort the Joint Action Group had gone through, there was no way they wouldn't check medical history later. If I looked too relaxed right now, then compared against my old hospital records, I would definitely become a priority target. Afterward, by the time I walked out of the observation room, the sun was shining brightly overhead. I picked up a takeout order of fried chicken and enjoyed the food while scrolling through my phone. The testing didn't finish until evening. A massive operation, no question. During this whole period, naturally, no one bothered me. At night, the news was flooded with the same reports. The global allergen test was carried out smoothly. A total of 314,285 individuals showed allergic reactions and had all been properly treated, with 0 fatalities. At midnight, the sixth piece of information was announced. The Inheritor bought fried chicken yesterday. I was stunned, speechless. You could do that, too. That clue narrowed the range down way too much. It was enough to slash the target pool to perhaps just 1,000 or so people. Still, it didn't really matter. After a brief moment of surprise, I calmed down again and let the night slowly pass. The sky had barely started to brighten. Outside the window, The sounds of activity had already begun. Every shop in the vicinity that sold fried chicken had received orders and opened early. They were checking transaction records, pulling surveillance footage, and entering faces into the official recognition system. At 9 in the morning, Director Wang arrived at my door again, this time bringing Joint Action Group personnel with him. Little Chen, yesterday, did you? Before Director Wang could finish, I directly answered. I was too tired after yesterday's test and couldn't be bothered to cook. So, I bought a fried chicken. The bones are still in the trash bag. Haven't taken it out yet. Then, that's enough to confirm it. One of the Joint Action Group men stepped into the room and said, without leaving room for dispute, you'll need to come with us. I understand. I understand. I nodded in agreement and casually carried the trash bag with me as I left. The moment I got into the car, my phone popped up the latest announcement released by the Joint Action Group. After screening, the pool of suspected inheritors had been narrowed down to 1,023 people. They would all be transported to the final observation site for the final round of verification. Please do not worry. At the bottom of the notice, in bold red letters, was one line. All suspected individuals must cooperate and are not allowed to refuse. It was obvious that among those 1,023 people, one of them was me. So, it was time to head to the final observation site. I turned and looked back at my home through the window, sighing silently. Well, that's fine, too. At least, this way, I wouldn't ruin such a nice place. The Joint Action Group vehicle stopped at the central plaza. The plaza, still packed with people yesterday, was now completely empty. Even those rows of testing tents had vanished at some unknown time, leaving not the slightest trace behind, as though they had never existed. Almost at the same time, two more Joint Action Group vehicles arrived. One person got out of each car, an old man and a young man, both wearing lost, bewildered expressions. Most likely, just like me, they were being sent to the final observation site. If one thought about it, the three of us actually had a lot in common. All surnamed Cheng, all type of blood, all unemployed, all allergic to acetaminophen, all bought fried chicken yesterday. The difference was that they were suspected inheritors. I was the real inheritor. The three of us exchanged glances in silence. There was a faint smile at each of our mouths. Theirs were bitter smiles. I returned their bitter smiles with an actual smile. After waiting a few minutes, a booming sound came from the sky. A helicopter descended from afar, dropping down with such commotion that it drew a crowd. In the distance, a little child tugged at his mother's hand and shouted, "It's them! They might be immortals!" We boarded the helicopter and rose into the sky amid the roar and shaking. The young man was practically vibrating with excitement. The old man looked extremely tense and kept rubbing his hands together. "Brother, where do you think they're taking us?" he whispered to me. "The final observation site." "Yeah, but where the hell is that?" "Don't know." I shook my head and pointed at the pilot. "He definitely knows." Unexpectedly, the pilot turned his head and smiled. "How would I know? Only taking you to the transfer station." "Therese, a transfer station too?" I was a little surprised. Guess the destination's pretty far. Then, the pilot didn't answer. "The farther, the better. Gods have appeared, and I haven't even left my province yet. Just treat this like a free trip." The young man picked the topic back up and continued. "Say, do you think that Inheritor will go to the observation site?" "He probably will," I answered carelessly. "I doubt it. Hez already a golden core, mighty one. He could just find some random place, use some invisibility technique, or hide 500 meters underground for 7 days. And that'd be that. Not bad ideas. Unfortunately, I didn't know how to do those things." I said nothing more, simply gazing down at the magnificent mountains and rivers beneath us. I didn't know why, but those unfamiliar landscapes made me feel deeply, inexplicably close to them. The helicopter flew for over an hour, and once we reached the transfer station, we switched to a modified military aircraft. The young man was so excited, he nearly bounced off the floor. The aircraft roared through the sky for half an hour, and after landing, we switched to another helicopter for another half-hour flight. At last, we reached our destination, The final observation site. A massive complex of buildings built in the middle of a desert. Tall walls surrounded the complex. High-voltage electric fencing and cameras covered the top. And every dozen or so yards there was a guard post. Armed soldiers standing there with stern faces, scrutinizing everything in sight. Helicopters landed and took off one after another. All 1,023 suspected inheritors were delivered here. Not one more, not one less. We were led into the complex and assigned individual rooms. The rooms were small and extremely simple. You could honestly say they had everything except anything in a place this remote. The very fact that they had managed to transport suspected inheritors scattered all over the globe here so quickly was already no small feat. It was naturally impossible for them to do everything perfectly. Besides, there was only one day left now. There was really no need to waste energy on making it comfortable. The old man and the young man ended up sharing the same room as me. There was no handle on the room's door, only a small service hatch for delivering food. I had been locked up. No, more accurately, all of us had been locked up. 1,023 people, all shut away in this complex in the middle of the desert. The old man's face was full of sorrow now, and even the young man had lost his excitement. I sat on the bed and used my spiritual sense to inspect the entire complex. It was huge, taking up most of the valley. At the center of the complex stood a giant circular building. Inside it was all kinds of equipment I couldn't recognize. Maybe testing devices, maybe military equipment. A whole group of people were methodically gearing themselves up. Around the complex walls, electric nets, watchtowers, and surveillance systems were packed together, covering everything in all directions with no blind spots. Outside the walls, radar stations were set up every 500 meters or so, constantly scanning the airspace and the ground. And farther out, at the east, south, west, and north points, stood 4 large military bases. Inside were tanks, armored vehicles, anti-air missiles, and weighty nuclear warheads. Not one, a lot of them. They had been placed at different distances around the observation site. The closest were inside the site itself. The farthest reached all the way to the very end of my spiritual sense. There was no question. If even one of those nuclear warheads detonated nearby, the entire observation site would vanish from the map. It was now 4 in the afternoon. There were still 8 hours left until midnight of the 7th day. 8 hours later, once the final piece of information was announced, the Joint Action Group would most likely be able to lock onto me. At that point, every single weapon I had just seen would be aimed at me. At 10 that night, the loudspeaker came on. It was a man's voice, heavy with tension. "Everyone, I am Zhao Sheng, commander of the Joint Action Group. I know you are all confused and afraid, but please believe me. Everything we're doing is for the future of humanity as a whole. Please remain patient. Please remain calm." If he hadn't said anything, maybe it would have been better. That one speech made the repressed atmosphere explode completely. Someone in the room next door started crying. From the room across the hall came the banging and crashing of someone hitting the door. In the corridor, staff voices rang out, trying to calm everyone. "Don't panic. Don't panic. It will all be over very soon." At 11 p.m, the final hour before midnight, the old man had finally exhausted himself and fallen asleep. The young man curled up on the bed, trembling, likely from fear. After all, he was still too young. As the novelty and excitement of everything gradually faded away and reason regained control, he had finally realized that tonight might be the last night of his life. I sat with my eyes closed in quiet contemplation. Outside the room, the footsteps of patrolling soldiers rose and fell in the hallway. Outside the building, someone took a deep drag on a cigarette, and the ember glowed red. In the office block east of the complex, the crisp, pleasant sound of a telephone ringing echoed through the corridor. Zhao Sheng hesitated for a long time, then finally picked up the call. "Commander Zhao, take note. You are acting against the highest directive." The voice on the phone was full of deep displeasure. "The time hasn't come yet. We still have one final day. Our final day is the Inheritor's final day too. Are you gambling the fate of all humanity? My luck has always been very good before this." "Commander," the voice on the other end turned severe, paused slightly, then said, in a deep voice. Evacuate the final site. Execute the highest directive. A detective, not a murderer. That doesn't matter. Zhao Sheng let out a sigh. I'll execute it, but not now. The call was cut off forcibly. Zhao Sheng looked up at the pendulum clock on the wall and waited as time swung away with the pendulum. At midnight, the seventh piece of information was announced. The Inheritor, Chen Du. I was honestly surprised. I had never expected the seventh clue would simply reveal my full name outright. That took all the fun out of it. I turned my head and looked around. The old man was fast asleep. The young man had just finished looking over as well. A coincidence. No more than that. I didn't know their names. They didn't know mine. Chen Du. Zhao Sheng cried out in alarm and immediately opened the database to search. The moment the result appeared, he grabbed the walkie-talkie and shouted, "Attention, Team 1. Move immediately to Zone 3, Building 4, 5th floor, Room 6. Repeat, Team 1. Move immediately to Zone 3, Building 4, 5th floor, Room 6. Emergency evacuation. Emergency evacuation." The sharp and urgent broadcast shattered the silence, mixed with one automatic unlocking sound after another. Hundreds of room doors suddenly opened as they listened to the broadcast. People rushed out in panic, like refugees fleeing disaster. Only Room 6 remained shut. The startled old man and young man pounded frantically on the door, but it was useless. "Shit! Our door lock's broken," the young man shouted anxiously. "Bro, come help. If they start fighting and we can't run, we're dead." I bared my teeth in a grin. You ever think to raise another possibility that the lock isn't broken? They just deliberately didn't open this one. Why? The young man's brain finally turned, and he pointed at me, mouth hanging open. You. Just then, the door was suddenly flung open. A group of soldiers stood outside, black gun barrels already aimed into the room. The old man and the young man instantly froze in place, not daring to move 1 inch. Zhao Sheng stepped out from behind the soldiers and gave them a look, without even daring to turn their heads. The two of them bolted straight through the door. "You're the Inheritor?" Zhao Sheng asked in a low voice. I gave a short hum. Before the sound had even faded, the soldiers around me all pulled the trigger at once. Bullets whistled toward me. I neither dodged nor closed my eyes. A thought passed through my mind, and every bullet stopped 1 meter away from my body, as if they had slammed into an invisible wall. Then they dropped to the floor with a clatter. It was nothing more than the simplest outward release of spiritual power. A golden core stage spiritual barrier was more than enough to stop a few bullets. Zhao Sheng's face changed immediately. He took a sharp step back and shouted, "Target confirmed. Move." In an instant, the soldiers all retreated rapidly. 7 or 8 grenades were thrown into the room almost at the same time. Boom! A huge hole was blasted straight through the floor, but the soldiers retreating to the far end of the hallway didn't relax in the slightest. I floated slowly out of the smoke, completely unharmed. In the next second, bullets rained down like a storm, but in front of the spiritual barrier, those bullets were no different from beans. They were all deflected and fell to the floor with a constant metallic clatter. I hovered in the slanted hallway like an immortal descended from heaven. I stepped forward once, and every soldier stepped back once in perfect unison. In that single instant, Zhao Sheng understood that light weapons were useless. He immediately shouted into the walkie-talkie, "Heavy weapon strike! Heavy weapon strike!" At once, the soldiers began firing madly, covering one another as they retreated. Then, the hallway exploded open. Rocket shells tore through the walls, flames and shockwaves screaming toward me. But that was only the beginning. More rockets came flying from every direction. The entire hallway collapsed under the explosions, steel bars and shattered concrete raining down in a storm. And I still remained completely unharmed. That level of destructive force was child's play before a spiritual barrier. The barrage lasted 3 full minutes. The entire building collapsed into rubble, and the dust clouds covered half the sky. Instinct alone held me suspended in the air. With a casual sweep of my hand, spiritual power circulated through heaven and earth, and a wild gale rose at once. The dust cleared. The night deepened. Under the moonlight, countless black shadows hung in the air. Armed helicopters fire at a single command. The ammunition poured down. Machine guns raged. Missiles and rockets all launched without restraint, and I didn't move at all. I quietly accepted the baptism of their weaponry, watching it the way one watches fireworks or a string of firecrackers, celebrating the new era that was about to arrive. Only when the armed helicopters had exhausted all their firepower did the heavy rumbling sound arrive from far away. Ground forces had joined the celebration. Tanks, armored vehicles, self-propelled artillery, all advancing from every direction toward the observation site at full speed. I finally began to move. The atmosphere had reached this point already. It would be impolite not to stretch my muscles a little. I shot through the fire of the explosions and dove toward the ground, smashing a fist into the barrel of the first tank. The supposedly indestructible cannon barrel bent like a noodle. I spun, kicked the armor of the second tank. A huge dent caved into the plating. The treads burst apart, and the entire vehicle gouged deep tracks across the earth, only stopping after sliding more than 100 meters. The third one, the fourth, the fifth. I moved through the tanks and armored cars like a god of war in the night. Impossible to catch. Impossible to defeat. Damn, we can't lock onto him at all. Where is the Inheritor? What the hell is happening? God, only an angel could defeat him. The battlefield was filled with whales. In less than 3 minutes, every ground force unit that had rushed in to reinforce the site had lost combat capability. I looked toward the sky once more. The appetizers were finished at last. The main course had arrived. Far in the distance, more than a dozen points of light were moving through the clouds at incredible speed. Missiles, not ordinary missiles, tactical missiles, each carrying hundreds of kilograms of high explosives. I was thrilled. I shot upward into the sky. Spiritual power surged from my palms and transformed into a vast invisible hand, condensing in midair and seizing the missiles one after another. The missiles struggled. Their engines roared, but they could not break free from my control. I grabbed one and hurled it at another, and the two missiles collided in the air, exploding into a massive fireball. Then the third, the fourth missile fireworks exploded, one after another, across the sky, and Zhao Sheng was almost in despair. Against that gorgeous night sky backdrop, he watched me descend from above, lightly and gently stopping in front of him. I stood there as though basking in a spring breeze, smiling faintly. He, on the other hand, was gasping heavily, swaying where he stood on the ruins. The Inheritor truly is powerful. Hell, be even stronger tomorrow, I said, without the slightest humility. Zhao Sheng drew in a deep breath and looked around. Burning ruins, wrecked tanks, helicopters that had lost all ability to fight, spent shell casings and shattered missile fragments everywhere. In only about 10 minutes, they had failed even to lock onto my exact position, while their own side had practically exhausted all their strength. Only one final trump card remained. He raised the walkie-talkie. Target combat strength far exceeds expectations. Conventional weapons are ineffective. Begin the Heavens Punishment Protocol. His voice was very calm in a terrifying way. Comrades, see you in the next life. The firelight had long since vanished. The night was black as ink. He imagined that in the next second, the world would become bright as daylight, perhaps as blinding and scorching as the descent of the sun itself. But that imagined moment never came. Nothing happened. Zhao Sheng snapped out of that illusion. Why had the nuclear warhead placed inside the observation site not detonated on the spot? Why had the nukes deployed nearby not launched? Why? He murmured. I remained smiling. My spiritual sense spread outward. 10 kilometers away, 4 nuclear missiles rose from their silos, trailing long exhaust flames into the sky. 20 kilometers away, another 4 launched simultaneously. 30 kilometers, 40 kilometers, all the way to the end of my spiritual sense. Every 10 kilometers there was another group of nuclear missiles rising into the air from 4 directions at once. It was a bold saturation strike plan, like weaving a heavenly net of death out of nuclear warheads. No matter which direction I fled, I would collide head-on with a nuke. An almost perfect plan. Its one flaw was this: it assumed I was powerless against nuclear weapons. In truth, resolving them wasn't difficult at all. My spiritual sense spread like an invisible web, covering every nuclear missile that entered its range. Then, I found their electrical systems, and after that, I cut them all. That was all. The spiritual sense of a mighty golden core cultivator might not yet be able to solidify into tangible form, but cutting some wires within its range was laughably easy. Once the circuits were severed, the entire control systems failed. The nukes became no better than headless flies tumbling chaotically in the air. Using my spiritual sense as the guide, I reeled them in from every direction like dozens of kites, then neatly stacked them one by one beneath my feet like a pile of junk metal. Seeing that scene, Zhao Sheng turned pale. He opened his mouth, but not a single word came out. I looked down at him from above. After a long while, he recovered enough to ask in a hoarse voice, "If you were already invincible, why hide for so long?" "No particular reason. I just wanted a few extra days of ordinary life." "That's it. You wouldn't understand. I still have thousands of years of being invincible ahead of me. Just thinking about it is enough to make a person cold with loneliness." Zhao Sheng let out a bitter laugh and looked up at me. "You win." "Do it." I said from the very beginning that I was benevolent, at least for today. Zhao Sheng looked at me, incredulous. "Benevolent? We had already prepared everything. If you had only revealed yourself earlier." His words cut off halfway. I said I was benevolent, and no one would believe me, naturally. But when you all claimed you'd prepared everything for me and wanted me to become some kind of leader, who would believe that? Do you? Because I certainly don't. I descended and landed before him. The eastern sky was growing brighter and brighter. The first ray of sunlight pierced through the clouds, warm, bright, full of the breath of new life. I sat down on the spot and no longer spoke, no longer moved. I let Zhao Sheng leave. I let the wind blow over me. I let the sun shine down on me. I let time pass. No one came to disturb me again. The day passed in such plain, unremarkable fashion. At midnight, the golden core shattered, transforming into an infant identical to me. The infant burst out from my body, then merged back into me as one. 10,000 lightning tribulations struck down upon me. My body was remade. My meridians expanded. My dantian grew. A power unlike anything before erupted from the depths of my body. Like lava exploding upward, like a flood breaking loose, like stars detonating. It all happened in an instant. Great completion achieved. I rose and stood in the vault of heaven, my robes fluttering, faint light surrounding my body. With a single wave of my hand, spiritual power poured out and sank into the earth. The ground began to tremble. Broken stone and twisted steel in the ruins began to move on their own, reassembling themselves. Green vines burst from underground, climbing walls and blooming into flowers of every color. Clear spring water was drawn from 100 miles away, slowly surging up from beneath the earth and gathering into winding streams. In the blink of an eye, the ruins had become an immortal dwelling. When the sun rose and light once more blanketed this land, only then did Zhao Sheng, through satellite surveillance, notice the change. His expression was incomparably complicated as he looked at me, and at that same moment, I raised my head. My gaze pierced through the satellite feed and reached straight into his soul. Then I said lightly, "Bring me a bowl of beef noodles."